Hi again. This is the second part of the explanation of the 10th grade module. Okay, we are on page 11. There's a little table there also. It first starts with the definition of poetry, literary work in which special intensity is given to the expression of feelings and ideas by the use of distinctive style and rhythm, poems collectively or as a genre of literature. So it basically talks about literature. And then about poetry. And that's a definition of it. And then there's a table that says elements of poetry and drama. I don't know why they mixed it up together. Maybe I wouldn't have mixed them, but they do have a lot of things in common. Okay, so it talks about figurative language, lenguaje figurado. Okay, so metaphors, onomatopoeia, all of that. Writers and poets use figurative language to build imagery and give words more power, okay? So it becomes more beautiful also. Connotation is the same as in Spanish connotación, okay? Words can have positive connotation or negative connotation, okay? So maybe it doesn't literally mean something. Maybe it's just a connotation. Like, for example, you can say, I feel great, like with a really sarcastic tone. And it has a negative connotation because, you don't really mean that. Okay? Repetition is literally a device that repeats the same words or phrases a few times. Like when you have a poem, maybe some words are going to be repeated. Alliteration, it says the occurrence of the same letter or sound at the beginning of adjacent or closely connected word. Okay? So it's the same letter sound of words that follow like one another in a poem. Maybe they're separate, but they're there. Like they all have the same letter sound. Okay? We could give more examples of that when we return to class. That one is a little more difficult. Imagery has to do with figurative language. The use of figurative language to represent objects, actions, and ideas. Okay, imágenes de lenguaje figurado. Irony. You guys have an idea more or less what irony is. Okay, so I can be ironic. For example, like. Somebody has an ironic tone or tells you something that he really doesn't mean, well, that person is being ironic, okay? Usually language that normally signifies the opposite, typically for humorous or emphatic effect, okay? So you know how to use irony. Voice. The voice in a text is like the sound of the text, basically. So, for example, there's a writer I really like. His name is Poe, and he writes in a very dark tone. Like the voice is usually like dark and somber. So usually it refers to the tone, and if it's a dark story, well, it's gonna have a dark tone. Okay, assonance. It says in literature is the individual style in which a certain author writes his or her works. Okay, so the assonance has to do with the voice. Okay? And you have to keep that in mind when you answer in the exercises. There are many other elements of poetry on page 12. It talks about mood or tone, symbolism, when you try to symbolize things, right? For example, like symbolism, like something black could mean death or stuff like that. Stanza is a verse. Word order, the words, like how they are arranged. And then it talks about poetic forms. You have to read each one. There's free verse, blank verse, and blank verse, which are they give you specifically the table tells you specifically the difference between the two. I'm not gonna go into that because it's a little bit more difficult to explain. But try to more or less understand each one. There are no difficult exercises that ask you about free verse or blank verse, but I will explain them when we come back, okay? And then the poetic forms on page 13, you basically have to read each poetic form there. It talks about the haiku, the sonnet, the tanka. I can give you examples of that when we come back. But try to answer the exercises as best as you can, knowing that I haven't really discussed or haven't been really deep into poetry, but I can talk to you more about it when we return. Read the poems on page 14 and 15. On the next video, I'm going to read them. This video, I can't make the videos too long because YouTube doesn't let me do that. But on the next video, on part 3, I'm going to be reading the poems, okay? So that you can get an idea what they mean, alright?